Good afternoon, everyone. So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Wali, and I welcome you all on behalf of CSPS fraternity. So, let me brief you about CSPS. Center for Studies of Plural Societies is one of the emerging and rapidly growing non-profit social science research organization in India. It was established in 2021 and is based in New Delhi. So it is an independent institution dedicated to democratizing knowledge and creating access to it by undertaking direct skill development and mentorship of students and research scholars engaged in humanities and social sciences. The organization aims to create an international network of scholars contributing to quality scholarship, inclusive policies, and impactful public interface. CSPS brings together renowned and emerging scholars, writers, civil servants, and practitioners who impactfully contribute to research and engagement in public space. As it grows, CSPS aims to research various academic and policy relevant issues while focusing on contemporary socio-political and historical issues. Over the past few years, CSPS has engaged with a diverse pool of academics, policymakers, diplomats, and civil society practitioners to enrich the debate and discussion on its agenda of an inclusive, deliberative, and democratic public sphere. Amongst us, we have Professor Sutapa Datta. She is a professor of English at Gagi College, University of Delhi. Her research interests and publications are focused on 18th and 19th century writings and cover gender, education, and identity in colonial India. She is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, London, and held a fellowship at the Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla, from 2018 to 2020. Professor Datta has authored British Women Missionaries in Bengal, 1793 to 1861, and edited British Women Travellers, Empires and Beyond. She has co-edited Mapping India, Transitions and Transformation, the 18th and 19th century. Her most recent book is Disciplined Subject, Schooling in Colonial Bengal. The next one is we have Dr. Shivangi Tandon. She is an assistant professor in history at Women's College, Aligarh Muslim University. Her research interests include early modern South Asian history, feminist theory, and question of language. She did her BA and MA from St. Stephen College, PhD in history from University of Delhi, and she is a former visiting fellow at Max Planck Institute for Human Development, Germany. She has been invited to many national international forums as a speaker. Her articles have been published in edited books and journals like Indian Historical Review, Journal of South Asian History and Culture, and by Nehru Memorial, New Delhi. She is the recipient of prestigious fellowship and awards like Max Planck India Mobility Grant and Sanwa Bank Scholarship and ICHR Foreign Travel Grant. The next one is Professor Simi Malhotra. She is a professor and former head of the Department of English at Jamia Millia Islamia and former director of Center for Northeast Studies and Policy Research. She is an expert in literary and cultural theory with a focus on postmodernism, globalization, and the intersection of media and politics, alongside an interest in folk cultural forms. Her recent publications include Food Culture Studies in India, Consumption, Representation and Mediation, and Inhabiting Cyberspace in India, Theory, Perspective and Challenges, as well as the co-authored Terrains of Consciousness, Multi-Logical Perspective on the Globalization. Her research interests span contemporary literary and cultural theory, globalization, popular culture, politics and folk traditions. The next one is we have Professor Farhat Hassan, Professor of Medieval.
He needs no introduction.
So now
No, please go ahead.
Please go ahead.
medieval and early modern South Asian history at University of Delhi. He holds a doctorate from University of Cambridge, where he received a Commonwealth scholarship. His research focuses on the political culture and literary trends of the Mughal Empire, as well as Indo-Muslim politics and culture during the colonial period. Now I want to hand over the mic to Professor Hassan.
Am I supposed to do?
We don't have mic.
It's just these star speakers.
No, no, please.
So,
I have nothing to say.
For the opening remarks, we want.
Right. Yeah, I guess I should begin by congratulating the editors for this very interesting collection of essays on 18th and 19th, on women and gender in 18th and 19th century colonial India. Historians usually see 18th century as marking the development of modernity in South Asia. And there have been several studies on the economic developments taking place in the 18th century, social developments, cultural developments. Gender is relatively less studied, and therefore this book makes an important intervention in that context. But I think the most substantive issue that this book engages with is in identifying the gender dimensions of early modernity. And the central question that this book poses is how does modernity in South Asia entangle with and is tied with important articulations of gender in 18th and 19th century India. You see, and then therefore there is a correlation here between articulations of gender and formations of early modernity. And I think this is where this book, and there are several essays here in this collection that make a substantial contribution. One area there where I found there's been a systematic engagement with this issue is the space of the household, where several contributors, I'm not naming any of them here, several contributors make this interesting argument that the 18th century saw a shift in the distribution of affect and emotions in these spaces of the household. And you also notice the development of conjugal intimacy and companionate marriage in 18th century India. Now this is a very important argument because we were led to believe that conjugal intimacy came to India through colonialism. And then to be able to trace it to the pre-colonial period and to make an argument that this is specific to the Indian cultural context is something that is very interesting and very important. I also thought that because the issue of language is also very important here, and I think because 18th century saw a huge expansion in literacy. There's a huge expansion in the use of paper, pen, and ink in this period of study, and we need to look at the cultural significance of transformation of a society from orality to literacy, and to see how this transformation impinges on gender relations. But there is, because of this expansion in literacy, you also notice multiplicity of genres of writing taking shape in 18th century India. And this raises a very important question as to the specificities of the choice of genre and meaning formation, as also the specificity of gender articulation in terms of the choice of genre, as also language choice, because this is also a multilingual world. I think, and the last issue that I think I found very interesting is the effort to recover women's voices or women's agency. Obviously, that's a very difficult ground because we do not have an archive that refers to women's voices. But there's an interesting combination of incidental references to women's voices in the archive, combined with non-verbal means of communication. So there were several essays that look at dances or dancers, or dance as a medium of communication for women. And I thought the effort to bring the verbal and the non-verbal means of communication together to be able to recover women's agency and subjectivity was another very important dimension to this book. I'm just cheering, so I won't take all the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think now Simi should take over.
No, it's time.
No, I think they're supposed to speak, I'm supposed to.
Yeah. All right, yes. So I'll begin by, of course, thanking Mr. Zaidi and Mr. Kasif for giving us this opportunity. Very, very grateful to CSPS for giving us this platform where we can discuss this with our others who are interested in 18th-19th century studies. Well, this book began around with a conference actually, which happened because of Simi. Simi gave us the space in Jamia to hold the conference, and the conference I run a society called the India International Society for 18th Century Studies. Okay, specifically to do with 18th century. It's an international society. I run the India chapter here. So we did a conference, and of course the conference was attended by very well-known historians and scholars, right? Some of them are no more, yeah. And after 2020, we decided, because of the conference papers that came in, which were like so, they were really, really good papers. So we wanted to bring it out as an edited volume, but then the COVID happened, and well, we lost a couple of our colleagues in that, a couple of people who had come and spoken in the conference, and of course it was almost my that I will do it, despite the fact this is one way of paying homage to them, right? So and it took us 2.5 long years of going in and out of the hospital. Both Shivangini and I were very, very ill at that period of time, and of course the other contributors found it very difficult to do their archival work and write their papers, but we managed, and then this was finally the result of it. So I'm extremely proud of this baby, especially because out of my 5 books, I'm very proud of this baby, because this has actually been a very tough one, right? So yes, so when we were doing it, we realized that we intended to do it in a way where we would look into the constructedness of womanness, and as Professor Farhad Hassan said, there were of course multiple registers of sexuality that you saw in 18th century, multiple definitions of womanness and masculinity. So how exactly do we bring that in? Again, 18th century was of course the colonial period, the introduction of modernity in India, and the European or the Western concepts of womanness or womanhood being introduced to India. Okay, and how is it that people react to that, or are trying to give a multiple dimension to the entire discussion of womanhood? So my intention was to look at various parts of India to see it, because obviously it could not just be either North India or any other part of it. So I tried to look into the constructedness of womanhood through papers which would cover the geographical area of India. That was one of my conditions, okay? And of course then, that was number one. And the second thing was not just to look into literary material, but again, as Sir said, maybe the oral repository of constructing womanhood. And when I looked into oral repository, I looked into songs, poems, okay, and dance forms also, okay, any form of art form which was trying to represent or construct, or not just represent or construct, or maybe an alternate form of womanhood, okay, or challenging that, right? So we divided the book, Shivangini and I divided the book into 4 parts. The first was the private and the public world, because this was something which was heavily in discussion in the Victorian, in the 18th, 19th century. The angel in the house, right? And then the construction of who is the other, right? Okay, so the private and the public world, for a place like India, what actually denoted the Andar Mahal, Bahar, right? Okay, and was there a tension between that, or is it something which the colonial world constructs it to be? So we have 2 very good papers there, where Shazia Malik has looked into the dancers of Kashmir, the Hafizas, Where exactly are they? On the borderline of inside, outside? Where is it? Okay, and there is one another paper by Tarat Swami Dutt who looks at Avadi Zanana, and looks into the representation of how women were depicted there. Okay. The next part is called questioning the normative, okay? Where what is masculine, what is feminine, right? And there is a very interesting paper by Riya Gupta. I wish she had come. I think she was a student. Was she? Riya Gupta, yes. So it's like, it's not just defining woman and womanness, but how is the Mirza being defined? Okay, the man, yes, isn't it? So
Fantastic.
yes, isn't it? And by then corollary, the woman gets defined. Okay, so this gender binary. So if one defines masculinity, okay, there was a book called Mirza Nama, which defines who a man should be or what a man should be. So of course, then of course it also becomes that what the what do you call her? The Beg, Mirza Beg, right? Yeah. Okay. So how is that? How is she defined then, right? Okay. And the next chapter is by Charu Gupta. She's again a very renowned historian who has contributed one chapter and looked at Virangana women. Okay, Dalit women in the 18th-19th century who are Viranganas, okay, fighter women, right? And she looks at Dalit women to see how they constructed a space for themselves as an alternate form of womanness, womanhood. Okay, they're the fighter women, right? But how do they find a place for themselves there? And then I included a chapter, actually I commissioned a chapter in a way, because I wanted also an aspect of tribal, women who are from the tribal areas, to see how their voices were actually, you know, I'm trying to give it as much as a broader perspective as possible. So Maya Unithan, she's in Sussex University, and she has given a paper on gender and tribal identity in Western India. Again, I'm trying to give it the east and the west, north, south, Kashmir to west, wherever, you know, the various areas, okay. And the Nilanjana Mukherjee's paper called Could Kali Be Bharat Mata? So the binaries of Indian goddesses also, right? There's a Kali and also there is the benign Durga. So she looks into these both, the binaries of these two. And the third part is titled The Problematic Others. Okay, where we look into the categories of tawaif, okay, courtesans, prostitutes, and eunuchs. Okay, Lubna's paper is on eunuch, and she will talk about it. Okay, I also wanted a paper to be included, which finally couldn't because the contributor was very, very ill, which looked into mother and motherhood. Okay, but that is something I still regret not being able to include that. But this is to do with the concept of creating this either a eunuch or a courtesan or a tawaif or a prostitute. You know, what are these categories? And it looks into the entire Awadh, Delhi, okay, belt. Yours is also the Mughal.
Yeah,
yes,
North
yes,
India.
yes, North India. And the last part we look into narratives of femininity, okay, through narratives, through literature. And one is of course by Vijaya Ramaswamy, Vijaya Ramaswamy, where she looks at, situates women in Tamil Mahabharata. And questions the different categories of women in the Tamil Mahabharata. So I'm looking at literary narratives, last part. And then Meenakshi Malhotra looks into songs, okay, songs of Vijaya and Agamani. That is when goddess Durga comes to this her homeland, okay, from the mountains. All right, how is she welcomed in the songs in Bengal? So Durga is visualized as a little girl, Uma, okay, who has come to her mother's place, and then there are people singing songs, okay, and then Uma sings songs to describe her the sadness of having to leave her mother's place when she's so very young. Okay, so the girl or the bride or the girl child and her feelings of having to leave the mother's place and going to husband's place, okay? That also resonated with a lot of Bengali women at that, girls especially, who were getting married at a very young age and had to leave them. So it was through Uma that these voices were being depicted, okay, of little girls who were getting married at that young age, okay. So these were Agomani songs. These are called Agomani songs, okay. And the last one, again I asked Nizara Hazarika to write a paper for us. She is an associate professor in Assam, and I asked her to particularly to write a paper because I wanted a colonial perspective of how Christian women were actually looking into the entire thing, because we have had very broad perspectives from Hindu women and about Hindu women and about Muslim women, but what about the entire influence of the missionaries and Western education, and how were Indian women then coping with that, or how did it transform or change the way they thought about themselves, okay? Especially Western education. So that again is a very good paper. So therefore, just to encapsulate, and I think after this Shivangini will take this up, is that we tried to give it a geographical breadth, as wide as possible, and we tried to include as many voices as possible from women across the breadth of the country, length and breadth of the country, and something which 18th century had not yet looked into as a gender perspective. As Sir was saying, this was something amazingly, I think it was very surprising, because when I look at it, I just can only see women and how women's lives changed in the 18th, 19th century, because I've worked extensively on the role of British women missionaries in Bengal, okay, or British women travelers in Bengal, and in the first schools that were opened by these missionaries were for women, not for men. Okay, these were for women, and education was started for women, and of course after that it was Zanana education, right? So a lot of changes were happening in the lives of women at that time, which completely remained silent, marginalized, out of sight, okay? And so how is it that women were coping up or giving alternate voices? And so we began with an introduction where I quoted Natalie Stolzer by saying there is no universal womanness, isn't it? And there is no universal womanness, as we cannot categorize it as who is a woman or what is a woman, because my womanness can be very different from yours, isn't it? So I gave an example by saying that the British Queen's womanness will be very different from the woman who works in the field. Okay, so therefore there is no universal womanness, and we've tried to see the polyphonous, especially the voices of women who actually articulate this multiplicity of gender, multiplicity of identity. Okay. And if you are interested, please go through this. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So a very good evening to all of you, and let me at the outset begin by thanking the Center for Studies of Plural Societies for having us here for our book discussion, and it really means a lot. And then I would also like to thank the chair, Professor Farhat Hassan, and also our very dear discussant, Professor Simi Malhotra, for taking time out from their busy schedules and being with us, and taking time out to read the book, and and ma'am will be discussing it further. And also to my friend, my mentor, Professor Datta, who actually was there as an inspiration throughout during the time of COVID, whereby we were juggling with various other things, health hazards, etc. And she was always there as a rock, and trying to tell me, no, we will get through this, and we have to get this done. So I'm really thankful to her, because she's the actual inspiration behind conceptualizing this entire book. And also a very warm welcome to all the audience who are here, and who made this effort to be here. So a lot of things Professor Datta has already made, I think, a very extensive summary of the book. What are the chapters like, what are the divisions like, and one had very insightful comments from the chair So I think I will like to be very brief. So these are just stray remarks that I wanted to make, because this book has also been reviewed by 3-4 reviewers. So if you're interested, you can have a look at that. So I just wanted to talk about something which, when we were writing this book together, trying to get the papers together, one didn't think about that. So let me at the outset begin by referring to the title. So 2-3 days ago, when I was thinking about this discussion, and I was trying to reread the book, then suddenly this term "making" really struck my mind. And I think what we left out unconsciously was that the making in this making of woman also very clearly explores the notion of performance or performativity. So though the chapters very well extensively talk about this notion of performance and performativity, but I think the engagement on our part somehow just got left out. So I thought that I'll talk a bit about that notion of performativity, in the sense of this being a cultural act. So from the various chapters that are there, it becomes very clear that how this gendering of human beings becomes a cultural act in terms of especially the gendered norms and practices, especially with regard to the 18th-19th century historical experience. So in this book, we made a conscious attempt through the study of particular literary genres that both Professor Datta and Professor Hassan mentioned, looking at languages, linguistic codes, cultural codes, in multiple spaces, etc. So by the use of all of that, the chapters here, I think they seek to unravel a very unique form of self-fashioning or reformulation of the woman, herself. Like, say for instance, all these chapters that Professor Datta just read out, they look at women in terms of their representation as either goddesses or as writers, as nautch girls, as tawaifs, and so on and so forth. Also, I was just reading something, I think 2 days back, and this concept of Bertolt Brecht, and we all know that he was a very famous German playwright and poet. So he gave this very interesting German concept, and I've written it down so that I don't pronounce it incorrectly. So it's Verfremdungseffekt. So this really fascinated me, and I was just wondering that if at all there is a way that I can connect this to the book. And then I thought, and correct me if I'm wrong, that sometimes a conscious effort is made to make an idea or a concept so obsolete and so strange that it loses its universal viability, global application, and its normative value itself. And that's how it becomes very easier to challenge or deconstruct it. So I think that in this book, both of us, this is exactly what we have tried to do. We have tried to destabilize or deconstruct these notions of previously held notions of gender, sexuality, what constitutes a woman, what constitutes womanness, things like that in this book. And especially with regard to the 18th and the 19th century, because like Sir very rightly pointed out, that this is the period which remains untouched, especially in terms of looking at gendered relationships of sexuality. So this was just one way where I thought that Brecht could be used. Now, just some very, just to highlight in maybe 5-6 points as to what our book exactly tries to do. So first is, of course, as was very rightly said in the beginning, that it tries to contextualize issues of gender and sexuality in the early modern South Asian historical experience. And you have almost all the chapters deal with that, right? Univocally. Secondly, it also tries to deconstruct the monolithic frameworks of looking at these concepts of woman and womanness. And I think Dr. Lubna Irfan's chapter, where she looks at eunuchs and construction of the other, and it also, I think it also destabilizes the gendered meta-narrative. So I think her chapter really helps us to critically engage with these concepts of woman and womanhood. Then thirdly, the book also has made an effort to look at the restructuring of family and household, especially in the 18th century, as Sir very rightly pointed out. And I think Dr. Riya Gupta's chapter, where she looks at these conduct manuals called Mirza Nama, and how she engages with the concept of a Mirza, vis-a-vis Mirzada Begum or a Mirzada Khanam, and by looking at the construct of the Mirza. Actually, Mirza was a kind of a metaphor which was used for a perfect ideal man, during the Mughal period. And there were certain guidelines, which were given in these conduct manuals called Mirza Nama. There were other such akhlaq and conduct manuals, whereby it was, actually given that how is, like, what constitutes a gentleman. So these are certain things that you are supposed to be or you are supposed to have in order to behave like a gentleman. Now, how can you place these definitions of gentlemanly behavior and connoisseurship vis-a-vis the construct of a woman, for example? So, I thought that this was also very interesting. Again, the third thing that this book highlights is, of course, though we have an entire section on the private versus the public, but let me add to what Professor Datta said. We are not sort of reiterating the fact that there was a division of this private versus the public in the South Asian historical experience of the 18th-19th century. Rather, what we are trying to argue in, and if you look at the chapters in that section, then it will become very clear to you that unlike in the West, unlike in Europe, where you find a clear-cut dichotomy between the private and the public world, such kind of, and which has also been challenged by the feminist movements, such kind of dichotomy between the private being the feminine space and the public being the masculine space, such kind of dichotomies did not exist in the South Asian historical experience, especially of the 18th and the 19th century. And the chapters in that section, private versus public, makes it, amply clear. Particularly, I think that this, yes, so this chapter on, by Shazia Malik's chapter on the female dancers in Kashmir that she looks at, this is one thing that, acts as a corrective to this dichotomy that one continuously talks about. And also then this Tarasamy Datta's chapter on redefining the Zanana, of redefining the public space as such. Then, of course, lastly, the book also talks about that, what role did language and genre play, in meaning formation, and especially in terms of gendered narratives or gendered outlook. And this has been dealt with very efficiently in this chapter, both by the late Professor Vijaya Ramaswamy, where she's done a critical analysis of many women characters in the multiple renditions of Ramayana in the Tamil language, and also by Meenakshi Malhotra, about which Professor Datta spoke at great length. So I think, genre and meaning formation and linguistic registers were equally important when, in the 18th and the 19th century South Asian historical experience, gender was being, constructed, reconstructed, deconstructed, redefined, and things like that. Now, also one needs to remember, just to, there was a question there might be a question in the minds of many readers that, why look at the 18th century at all, especially in terms of notions of gender and sexuality. So, I thought that this would also be a good sort of a, discussion point here. So 18th century, as many of us know, was a period of transition, and it was a period of flux, where one sees new communities of merchant, gentry, traders, etc. coming up. One also sees the coming up of new, social spaces, this newly conceived spatiality, which, in terms of coming up of kasbas and ganj, which Professor Seema Alvi and Sanjay Subramaniam and Muzaffar Alam talks about at great length. Then also one sees new spaces of communication, dialogue, which was coming up. So we talk about all these things, how were structures changing, how were laws changing, and things like that. But one thing which is very starkly missing in all these narratives is how did this entire transition have an effect on the lives of women? As in, and how were they trying to deal with these transformations, these transitions, So I think that was one thing, and of course, because we have an entire society which studies the long 18th century, so I think this was one of the reasons that we thought that it will be very useful, both for the faculty, for the students, and for people interested in questions of linguistic registers, gender, sexuality, etc. So this book will be very useful because this is exactly what it does. Places the woman and her womanness within the center stage. Brings her from the periphery, from the margins to the center stage. So.
That's a very good point that you make, because I just forgot to mention about the title, Making the Woman, right? And it was actually suggested by a colleague, a fellow with me who was in IIS, the Advanced Studies Shimla, Professor M.V. Narayanan. He is now the Vice Chancellor in Kaladi. So it just, also because he
that
also...
time we discussed it also.
Yeah, we discussed
but somehow we forgot to, I think, mention.
Yes, so, and also because he's from the performative arts.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
exactly.
So it never struck me, and that was, so it's a very simple title, but it of course has many meanings behind it. You know, it's the constructedness of it, the performance of it, yes, yeah, okay. So would I like to talk?
Do we, like Suni ma'am, I think should make
I don't know what I should say after this, but really, I mean, I must of course congratulate both Shutapa and Shivangani for this absolutely fascinating book. I mean, I think it's a very significant and important book, and while I had, in the preparation stage encountered the book, in its loose form, but reading it like this was really a very rewarding and very enriching experience for me. And I think we're very lucky that Professor, and I've always been a big fan of
every conference he has attended, he is so graciously.
Absolutely. No, but I think the forward is very important. It sets a lot of things, the agenda for the book in some ways, and opens up the debate beyond the individual chapters to really talk about, things which would be important in the context of this book to talk about. But I think the fundamental point which he makes about modernity, and I think that's something that, and just to first start off by what Shivangani ended with, that I think 18th century is crucial to this book, because I think this book makes such a significant, I mean, it's not very sharply marked out, but it certainly does point to the direction in terms of the changes which happened between 18th century and 19th century. And I think the lever of colonialism and how that went on to also alter the discourses in the household, outside the household, the private and the public, etc., I think is very, very clearly shown. And I think this book would not have been this book had it not covered both the 18th and 19th century in that sense. So I think that transition is something which comes through in this book, and I think that's why it's absolutely justified. But just to just a few things that I felt that one could talk about in the context of what Farhat has written about, and starting from there, I think Shutapa and Shivangani write in their introduction about this revisionist historiography, which has tried to recover the voices of women through the 18th century and 19th century, and we've been seeing a lot of researches happening for a long time now, for the last few decades, about the recovery of these voices in different forms, and and I'm glad that the spectrum of this book has opened up. The question of not the ontology of the woman, that who's a woman, and I'm really glad that though in the book it's written who's a woman, but he also said what is a woman, I mean, and I think it's also very important, and I think that's something which is there in the book, in the sense that not only Lubna's chapter on the eunuchs, but also, that very, I mean, I found that such a fascinating chapter, because I have a whole storehouse of condom books for girls, from 18th, 19th century, and to actually see, condom books for boys, I mean, it's a completely different register in that sense, which is so interesting. But I mean, the fact that the gender dimension of modernity is opened up to a canvas which looks at the whole spectrum of genders is something which is very, very special about this. And I don't want to really, do exactly the reverse kind of a thing, that, the West and the East and the North and the South, and, our experience is somehow richer, and so therefore we are probably talking in a register of post-colonial, decolonial, ways of looking at South Asian history and things like that. But certainly, I mean, this aspect of modernity, where gender would become such an important aspect, and, one looks at this whole spectrum of gender, where one looks at all these different aspects of gender is something which is very, very interesting in that sense. But the other thing which is the whole idea of the public sphere, and one will have to really think about whether one, and I think your book does that very clearly, where you do not, you invoke the idea of the public sphere, of the public and the private, because that's fundamental to how we constitute the idea of modernity, let's see the discourses which have come to us from the West. But the fact that one would problematize the notion of the public and the private, and that's been done. Let's say Habermas's notion has been critiqued by Nancy Fraser and others, and so many others in that sense. But I think in this context, the very interesting categories which have come up, especially in relation to, let's say, the Zanana. The idea of seclusion, yes, exactly. The idea of seclusion is not about exclusion only, and so therefore, how, probably one needs to invoke a completely new grammar and language and vocabulary to talk about this public-private dichotomy, and to probably think of a new vocabulary from South Asia, which also looks at these spaces. And one spoke about the architecture and spatiality, and I'm very fortunate that I have a student actually who's working on a register of language which actually emerges from the Zanana, which is the Begumati Zuban, and it's very interesting, that the Begumati Zuban is appropriation by Rekhti, and then of course with a certain standardization of language, how that space for women, in the Zanana gets standardized into, a different kind of a discourse. But so these recovery or these revisionist historiographies which try to recover these voices and to also look at, and so therefore, I don't know if one would want to use the term of literary public sphere or not. Because obviously one is not really hooked onto the idea of the letter or to the to the idea of the literary in that sense, because one is also in the book, and that's why the book is so rich. Looked at orality and performativity and different registers of songs and dances and communities of dances and categories of the nautical or the courtesan or the and these are very important political figures also, and that's something that we've seen in a lot of historiography in that sense. But I think one will need to think about that. How do we look at this? Do we look at it as a public sphere? And we see between the 18th and 19th century a great division in some senses. Not only vis-a-vis what was happening with as Farhat has also written in his foreword about the pen and paper and the state, and also the the whole engineering of education and it affecting the household and what it was trying to do and etc and all that, but also in terms of whether one can look at the 18th and 19th century literary I don't want to use the term literary public sphere, but the literary registers or the registers of women's articulation differently, because I think that's something which also this book clearly does, and certainly does help us in some ways. But to borrow something from Farhat, I think we are so centered on signification and meaning formation, and when one looks at meaning formation, one is looking at signification and looking at representation, and that has largely been the vocabulary of how we've tried to do a lot of revisionist historiography. But as theorists of emotions and affect have kind of given us another leaf, probably to look at recovery of revisionist historiography also from other registers of emotions and affect. And in there, and there's just a food for thought for you guys, if you're interested in this project beyond this book, which is that, now one of the things that, of course, a lot of work which is being done on, the figure of the Tawaif, or the eunuch's role in the political state, or, in the, or the maneuverings and, court, etc., and all that. And somehow, and of course, the nature of the household itself is changing in some senses, but one almost tends to undermine some of the registers of the household as secondary or not as important. For instance, I don't remember whose paper it was, but said that most of the registers, they primarily talk about food and clothing. It's dismissive of food and clothing in some senses, and yet we know that food studies and food culture studies, of course, has gone on to have its own revisionist kind of a historiography of recovery of food. And I'm somehow fond of Virginia Woolf, but when she makes this comment, and that's a comment which has stayed with me, and that in some ways also informs, how probably we also need to, probably augment our own methods in some senses, which is that, when she makes this whole point about, if you go to the libraries of Oxbridge and you look at the shelves, you don't find books by women, probably you need to enter the rooms of women and see how their walls themselves are imbued with creativity. equality, and so I think rather than feminist historiography thinking that feminist articulation of food or feminist registers of food or feminist dresses or sartorial senses are not as important, I think we need to probably make them as important as politics, political discourses or women's participation in political maneuverings, and I think there are hints of all that also in that sense, but I think that now I see a lot of new kind of historiography which is also looking at certain other registers which would have otherwise got undermined because we think that these are women's discourses. It's like men do the locker room thing and women do only gossip. Whereas gossip is of course a very important register of communication. Which should be recovered for the poor woman as a woman's form. So when Farhat and you also spoke about women's language and women's register. Women's genres in some senses, probably we need to isolate some of those genres and think about which are the genres that we want to really pick up, because there are those genres which are more ossified as genres, which are more accepted as genres, and then there are genres which go under those and don't really ever get accepted. So I think there's a lot of scope, which this book presents to us in terms of the future. But the future work which could have been done, in that sense. But and what is really remarkable about this book, and that's clear from what you said, Shutapa, which is that you made so much of effort to actually commission a lot of books so that there's representation. And obviously, howsoever representative any book tries to be, can never really represent everything. But this just as opposed to the extraordinary woman, there's also the 18th and 19th century which is inhabited by the ordinary woman, and what is the ordinary woman's presence in that sense. And so therefore what I'm saying is that one need not think of household as something which can only be recovered from the point of view of the household also becoming political and becoming a space, the zanana becoming a space, or the tawai figure being a person who's as a courtesan also liaisoning, beyond her caste and community or whatever, but probably the ordinary woman's ordinary life and the ordinary registers of everyday architecture of the kitchen, or when new materialism and new objectivism also looks at the history of materials.
That is the example of Uma.
Exactly,
talking about,
Uma, exactly.
Yes, where she's talking about the food that she will make
Yes,
there.
yes, absolutely.
Yes, and
Absolutely.
the mother's love and the lullabies that the mother sings for
Absolutely,
her.
yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
this is
And the only of course we want to talk about women's agency, in that sense. But the only other thing that I felt that probably one could have talked about is, and I think that's a very robust women's movement, in the 19th century, which is the Channa Revolt, and I think that's I felt that, also because in folklore, the woman who's cut off her breast is such an important figure in that sense. But I feel that I think feminist historiography has so much work to do, and not just feminist historiography per se, if it has to become gender just in some sense, but it needs so much of work to do, because oftentimes one sees illusion of all these. People think that it's not the white man saving the brown man from the brown woman from the brown man. It's the brown women who are setting up schools, whether it's Fatima Sheikh or whether it is Savitribai Phule or Ruqayya Sakhavat Hussain, or even 19th century, which is, and it's such a lovely, fantastic, kind of a negotiation that one sees there happening in the Channa Revolt, where lower caste women are primarily questioning the upper caste, and this breast tax which was imposed on women, where they were not allowed to, and their negotiation with the British representatives of therefore adopting the Christian cloth and the Muslim cloth as opposed to the Hindu cloth, and it's a very protracted feminist movement which goes on from 1813 to 1859. In history, such protracted long movements of women's movement is, and so there are so many stories of women's agency, which are, and of course, if you come to 20th century, early 20th century, you already have the Nupilan and Manipur and things like that. So I think this book has been a real storehouse, and I must really congratulate you. I mean, it's a book I could not put down. It's a book. I had to read through the whole book, and I was reading it again yesterday. But I had, when I got the book, I read the book, read the whole book, and all the essays, and each one of them, I mean, so rich in research and so valuable, and opens up so many frontiers and so many, and I think this is a book which should be read by anybody who's interested in question of feminist historiography, feminism, history, 18th, 19th century, because it does so many things, and I think this is a very, very valuable contribution, and I really congratulate both of you for this absolutely fantastic, work, and I'm sure that there's a lot of research which will follow on the heels of this book. Really, really fantastic.
This the breast tax thing. There was a paper which actually.
No, I mean the reason why I said the reason why I said so is because there's a context to it. I mean, in the sense that then NCRT removed that from the
there was this young researcher from the University of Hyderabad who was supposed to give me that paper. It didn't come at the last minute, and when you're saying this, I was thinking I should have somehow pursued it. But then of course, the COVID did a little bit of me.
No, but I mean, see, one can always find a lack and one expects everything. But you've already given us such a rich treat.
A long time for that.
Such a rich treat.
Yes. Thank you so much for
Should I go ahead?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So I'll,
Such a fantastic chapter.
Thank you so much. I'll just not take much time because I think enough has been talked about my chapter. My other discussants honored by that. My chapter, Unix 153. Right. So, despite without opening the chapter, I think from picking up from the discussion that was going on right now, I think the category of the Khwaja Saras, I like to use the term Khwaja Saras instead of the eunuchs because I think that is that is something that we need to do. We need to use the terms that were used at that point of time that we are talking about. So, when you look at Khwaja Saras, they challenge. First of all, they challenge the binary between the men and the women. So that is one thing. So obviously that is something that is very obvious. But they also challenge the binary between the public and the private spheres that we are talking about. Since we're talking about the 18th century or early modern period, so we know that the spaces of the Zanana are supposed to be a private space and there are public spaces. And the boundary of this public and private becomes very porous with this category of the Khwaja Saras because they can move freely from one end to another, and that gave them a lot of authority and power because they were also in control of a lot of information that they can take from one place to another. In the chapter, I was very surprised when I started working on Khwaja Saras. I was very surprised that their work and they were limited to the idea of being protectors or guardians of the harem. When you look at the literary sources, which I have done, so in the chapter I have incorporated and used literary as well as material remains, literary sources as well as material remains. This comes from my the training of my supervisor again, because he has worked on material sources. So the thing that I was when I was looking at the literary sources, I was very surprised to find that Khwaja Saras were not only limited to the spaces of the harem, but they were also performing various other activities. They were also involved in battlefields. They were also, I think I have given the examples here that a Khwaja Sara can take up a stand against a person of a royal blood, and that was happening in the later Mughal period. So that was something that I found really curious and interesting, and when I started reading upon it, there was not much work, so I thought I should go ahead and write about it. So that is one thing that I find really interesting. But another thing, since we were already also, Simi ma'am was talking about the recovery of a lot of voices and histories through the register of emotions and that narrative. And when you look at Khwaja Saras, you understand that obviously their history has been lost through the cracks of history writing, because people are usually writing about women, gender or men, but they have missed out on this particular category of quote-unquote third gender. So when you look at if I look at the psychological aspects of Khwaja Saras, because I'm just quickly summing it up because my chapter is titled Leaving a Lineage in Stone. So this comes from a very emotional place, and there is only, because not as modern day historians are probably biased against the third gender, the contemporary historians or the recorders of history who were writing in, say, the time period of which we are talking about, they were also quite biased, and that is something that we know. But Tavernier, who is one of the travelers, he gives us an insight into their makeup of their mind in a way, when he mentions how Khwaja Saraz wanted to leave a lineage in stone by constructing these huge grand structures which will carry their name forward in posterity, because they are not able or they're incapable of having children, and that is something that was very, very that's something that's again a very emotional thing, because he mentions how Khwaja Saraz were very much they were very conscious of this absence of the inability to leave a lineage in blood. So that is why they are leaving a lineage in stone. But sadly, the structures that I have mentioned, they have become redundant. They have changed names also. So, for example, one structure that I have surveyed is in Agra by the name of Budiya Ka Tal. It is now known as Budiya Ka Tal, but it was originally a structure, and it is like a tank and a tomb and entire complex built by Etemad Khan Khwaja Sara. So I think through this chapter and through writing these kind of histories, I am also trying to recover the names, because we need to say these names, say what they originally thought should be done through these structures. Khwaja Sara, Etemad Khan, Aga Khan Khwaja Sara, right? So all of Khwaja Hilali. So all these names need to be remembered and recorded and read again and said again. So that was the idea behind this chapter.
So it's time for question and answers. So if anyone have any question, please ask. Any comments?
I have a question. If I'm Angveen and I have studied certain Persian texts as well, so I have just one question. There were many ethical treatises that were produced at that point of time. So conduct that you were actually, Shivangani was talking about, I wanted to know how much these were actually followed. So they were there, but are there any information that actually talks about that they were, quite followed in letter and spirit, for that matter?
Well, I think Farhad sir will be able to answer this question better. But as far as this particular conduct manual is concerned, Mirza
Yeah.
no, I'm just.
You're right.
So just this conduct manual Mirza Nama, on which we have a chapter in the book, I think that was being really followed. It also had certain, like I just told you, that you need to develop certain qualities if you wanted to be called a gentleman, for example, or a Mirza. Okay, and then it also had certain a pattern of ranking. A certain number of Zat rank and a certain number of Sawar rank and things like that. So these many horsemen one was supposed to maintain, these many soldiers, and then you had to behave in a certain manner. And also there are very detailed descriptions about how you should conduct yourself within the household. And mind you, this was for men. So how should the dining table be laid out, whatever, the dastarkhan or whatever was there during that time period, and what kind of dishes to be served, and in what should the dishes be served, how should the cutlery be, and things like that. So it's a detailed description of all that. And what makes it interesting is because this particular conduct manual was written for men. And so you could probably tell us about more such conduct manuals.
She's right. No, you're right. That's a very good question. These are didactic texts.
Yes.
Exactly.
You see, but the concern reading these texts is very different. The effort is to recover the shifts in the norms of manliness.
Absolutely.
They're still norms, so there will still be a considerable divergence from practice and these norms. But the interesting difference that we notice is this shift from manhood that is defined by martial valor, Jawamardi, to a new form of manhood in 18th century, that is defined by connoisseurship and conception. That's a Mirza. So the shift from Jamavardi to Mirza is the one that that plots the shifts in perceptions of the norms of manliness. But there's still norms, there's still didactic texts, but they help us provide clue to the shifts in perceptions of what constitutes an ideal man. It's a complicated issue too, because I don't know, because I'm not sure if if you do not have the category of gender binary in the Mughal period, then gender would primarily be constituted through perceptions of ideal manhood. There would be no perceptions of ideal femininity. No. It could also be argued, it could also be suggested, and it's debatable, that we do not have two genders in 18th century India. We actually have one normative gender, and that normative gender is man. And that makes this whole issue of norms of manliness considerably significant in understanding gender relations and shifts in gender relations in the 18th century.
And also, were these texts, I'm sorry, I'm just.
No,
Say
so
what?
I will take that
So,
question.
were these texts meant for a particular class or
Absolutely.
Any classes, yes.
what about the ordinary classes?
No, that's
And
something
do
we
we
should
find
understand.
any reflection
Norms
there?
of manliness do not only structure gender relations, they restructure all forms of social hierarchies.
Right.
So, the idea of an ideal man serves to create hierarchies with reference to women's bodies, but it also serves to create other forms of hierarchies based in class, caste, and race.
Absolutely.
And many scholars
So
have also
individual
used
servants were
different
If it
arguments
is
and
a
arguments,
purpose,
yeah.
it will
It was
manage
also
word.
a trickle down effect.
So if I may just add to that, I mean, of course, this is from a very the Mirza Nama point of view, but say the Bengali conduct books which were being written for women particularly, there of course the binaries were very, very clear. The conduct books will be mainly for women. So it was done through very insidious ways of getting the woman to understand who the woman should be. And as you said, does it practiced? Okay, so. That was your question, because see, these books were to be read as kathas. Like Lakshmi Panchali, Lokhi Panchali is what we say. So when the Lokhi puja is going on, the puja of the Lakshmi. So Lakshmi being the ideal woman, right? When the puja is going on, these books would be read by women, and it would say who Lakshmi is. So she is like. She should be modest, she should be this, that, whatever, right? So a woman who reads that is therefore trying to become like Lakshmi. Or therefore that is the parameter. Okay, do you fit into that or you don't? Okay, what your foot should look like. Okay, what your fingers should look like, right? Everything is told there, right? And she has to do that or try to do that. So is it followed? Yes, of course, because unconsciously you are being, brainwashed as to who is an ideal woman. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes. So you have to speak modestly. You have to speak in a particular tone. And your foot shouldn't be very big, and you have to be like, wear clothes like this, walk like this.
Over
yes.
a period of time,
Over
it
a
was
period of-
internalized.
Yes,
perhaps,
exactly.
yeah.
We internalize it. And especially when it is read in the context of goddesses. So obviously.
So was it only through the traditions like the kathas that you just talked about in Bengal? Was it only through these sorts of traditions, or was there a tradition of reading, the reading culture like the late 18th century conduct
Yes,
books?
it's an interesting question, because see, most of the women at that time were not literate. Okay, the only way that they could actually imbibe these the womanly characteristics was through the kathas, which were recited. Okay, so even if they couldn't read the katha as such, in the sense like book, they memorized it, and so the katha, that tradition passes on from one generation to another. Like, so if your mother has taught you that, you teach to your daughter, and it passes on. So it doesn't have to be absolutely literary there.
Right.
It is in oral form.
So it was circulating in oral culture.
Yes,
through oral
as oral culture.
traditions.
And of course it later, even now when you read up that katha, the katha book has remained almost the same.
Right.
What my grandmother read, if I continue to read it, the Katha book has almost remained the same,
Yeah.
you know, so, but of course now I don't have it in my memory. I would have to read it, and of course then I'll be so critical of it also. But that is a different thing. Yeah, but that has remained. That has remained. Yeah.
I have one more question. You talked about how in the 18th century, just a second. You said that unlike the European context, there were no gender boundaries or gender binaries or gender dichotomies between man and woman in the 18th century India, 18th-19th century India. Could you give us some examples? Of course, you must have mentioned them in the chapters or the research
There are at
papers.
least 3-4
But I'm
chapters.
quite
that-
curious to know, if you could mention a few examples.
So, see this dichotomy between the public and the private. So, to my mind, these are some of the terms which we have directly borrowed from the Western historiography. Like, say, for instance, the term of feudalism. So, though such terms are not very apt to be used in terms of the South Asian historical experience, but just for make life sort of simpler for us. We've used these terms, but if you look at the 17th and the 18th century, like say for instance, I've worked on Taskiras or the biographies. So especially in the biographies, if you look at the biographies of the 17th and the 18th century, so the space of the harem, for example. So if you read someone's K.S. Lal's book on the Mughal harem, which he wrote many years ago, and the kind of arguments that he's made, they've also been contested. So he said it was just a space of eros and space of gossip, and when the king wanted to get some pleasure out of his various women folk, then he just used to visit us and things like that. But there's a reason why this restrictive womanly space is being sort of depicted in that manner, because the kind of statement that one is trying to make, the scholars are trying to say, just because these were restricted womanly quarters, and that's why it was just full of gossip and eros and pleasure and things like that. So there was nothing, so it is a kind of deliberate belittling of that space. However, if you look at Tariq literature, the court chronicles might not give you so much a sense of how this dichotomy did not exist in the 17th and the 18th century. But if you look at certain other historical genres, like you look at the Taskira literature, the autobiographies, right? Then you have the Insha literature, the letters that some of these women wrote. So you will get a sense as to how the harem, for example, was also very much a space of politics.
Yeah.
Like, so who would become the next king, whose child would become the next king, and then trying to color the mind of the king and things like that. So you find a number of references like that.
Some of them were very active also. Some
Exactly,
of the women were very
exactly.
active in the
And so say for instance you have Noor Jahan. But again, the point that Sir made, all these women, these extraordinary women, they were being eulogized from a larger perspective, from a larger masculine perspective. So say for instance, when Noor Jahan is being eulogized in a taskira called Zakiratul Khawanin or Masirul Umra, there she's called as a perfect mard, for instance. That she was a woman of great attributes, and she used to play the polo and play chess and do horse riding and things like that. So all these things are mentioned, but at the end of the narrative, she becomes a mard. So it's actually, it's again, she's an extraordinary woman, and therefore she resembles a man, because of which one finds a reference there. And then also you have lot of such examples. You had Jahan Ara, Roshan Ara. They had their own ships and they were engaged in trade with the Europeans. So this is something that current day historians who are sort of engaged in distorting history would not like to let us know. And again, just I will try to relate it a little bit to what was your name again? Anveen. So I was just curious, are you a history student?
She's from Malaysia.
She's a history
Nalini
professor.
has been a student.
Oh, Okay, I was just wondering, I heard this name before, I'm sorry. You called me ma'am, so that's why I was
Where he's
just
teaching
Okay.
somewhere.
You must have often heard that unless and until medieval historians and they look at Tariq literature. So if you're working, if your primary sources constitute the Tariq literature, the court chronicles, then people are very happy, especially for the medieval scholars. Okay. And if you're looking at, foreign travelers' accounts, bazaar gossips, looking at bazaar gossips as a historical source, or you're looking at autobiographies, biographies, letter writing, and these conduct manuals, suddenly all these questions come up, that don't you think they are didactic in nature, and don't you think these things are actually being followed? Well, my point is that if you look at the Tariq literature, the subjectivity of the author was very much entrenched in that, right? So if you look at Abul Fazl's, work, and then if you try and look at it, parallelly with what Muntakab Tawariq, for example. So, Badauni's narrative. So you will find a completely different picture of the king. I've often, people have often asked me these questions, and I'm sure that they've asked Lumna too. So whenever you choose to look at a lesser known historical source, suddenly people start asking you, do you think it's an actual source of history? Yes. So do you think that it's actually history and things like that? So I think we need to problematize these notions of what actually constitutes history. So because if we don't, then we are just stuck with a very positivistic notion of history, right? So I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you so much.
Any more questions? No? Okay, so in the end, I request Professor Hassan for closing remarks.
He has already made all the remarks.
Already been said. Thank you very much.
Thank
We
you.
had a
Yes,
very
thank
interesting
you.
discussion, and I learned a lot from the participants, the editors, and of course the expert here. It was very fascinating. It was quite a learning experience, and we discovered new insights about gender history, about gender relations, and women's lives. So thank you very much. It was quite a learning
No,
experience.
and
thank you for
when
having
the
us
sequel,
here.
no, that of course I'm very grateful that all of you could spare time, and I would expect the sequel to this book.
Yes.
There is so much,
Yes.
so much has been talked about, but there
He's
is.
goading me to do another one,
Yeah.
and I'm going to do it after this.
Yeah, please do that, because the thing is that these subjects are not discussed generally, in academic circles also. So if you have taken up this subject, then try and go beyond various.
Absolutely. That's an interesting.
Yeah. Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Okay, one thing, this
So let's take a picture.
Mirza Sara, Khwaja Sara phenomenon is only confined to the North India, or
हो गया